All right, everyone, settle in. Today, we're going to tackle a really fundamental puzzle in our field, one with massive consequences for professionals across the globe. And the question is this: are the language tests we design, the ones we stake careers on, actually measuring what it takes to succeed on the job? So let's start with an anecdote that gets right to the heart of the matter. Imagine this. A group of students is struggling with their technical papers, and naturally, they blame their English skills. But their professor points out something absolutely critical. The mistakes they were making? They were the exact same mistakes her native English-speaking students were making. Their problem wasn't a language deficit. It was a failure to master the very specific, very particular register of their own field. And that story right there leads us to the central question for our entire session today. If someone can ace our tests, get the certificate, but then flounder when it comes to actual on-the-job communication, we have to ask ourselves, are we using the right yardstick, or is our ruler measuring something else entirely? Okay, let's really start to unpack this puzzle. To get to the bottom of this, we first need to understand the two very different philosophical starting points for designing a language test. It really all comes down to where the test gets its DNA, so to speak. On one hand, you have general-purpose tests. These are born from abstract, top-down theories of what language ability is. But on the other hand, you have language for specific purposes, or LSP tests. Now, these are supposed to be built from the ground up, starting with a deep analysis of a real-world context, what a doctor or a pilot or an engineer actually does with language. But here is the critical disconnect. This is where it all goes wrong. We might go to great lengths to create an LSP test with super realistic tasks, a nurse explaining a complex procedure to a patient, but then, and this is the kicker, we turn around and grade that performance using the same old abstract general linguistic criteria. It's like meticulously recreating a Formula One race car and then judging it based on how well it parallel parks. The tool just doesn't fit the task. So this isn't just a theoretical debate for a grad seminar. This mismatch has profound, real-world consequences. Let's look at a case study where this exact problem played out in a very high-stakes environment. So let's talk about the Occupational English Test, the OET. It was developed specifically to assess the English skills of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals who wanted to practice in Australia. I mean, you really can't get much more specific purpose than that. But look at how they decided to grade it. The scoring criteria were lifted directly from a general-purpose test designed for diplomats back in the 1950s. It focused on these broad categories like fluency and grammar, which implicitly compares the test taker to some idealized native speaker, not to what makes a competent, effective doctor. And, well, you can probably guess what happened next. A troubling pattern started to emerge. Step 1, a doctor or nurse would pass the OET. Step 2, they'd start working in a hospital, and their supervisors would start filing reports saying their communication skills were just not up to par. Which leads to the inevitable step 3. The test was clearly missing something absolutely essential. Researchers who investigated this came to a pretty blunt conclusion. They said, and I'm quoting here, whatever the doctors were complaining about was not being captured by the OET. The real-world's communication breakdowns happening in the hospital were simply invisible to the test. The test wasn't built to see them. So, what was the test missing? What was this invisible element that determined success or failure in the real world? Well, the answer lies in a really powerful concept that completely reframes how we should think about assessment. The key lies in what the literature calls indigenous assessment criteria. Now, don't let the term intimidate you. All it means are the standards that the insiders, the subject matter experts themselves, not linguists, but the actual doctors, vets, or physicists, use to judge one another's communication. It's the insider's perspective on what works. And I really want to hammer this point home. We are not talking about abstract rules of grammar or pronunciation. We're talking about the practical, functional standards for getting the job done effectively. These criteria are woven into the very fabric of the professional culture itself. Okay, so this all sounds good in theory, right? But what do these indigenous criteria actually look like out in the wild? Let's examine some of the research. Let's take a look at one study of physicists. When they were asked to evaluate conference presentations, Look at what they cared about. Articulating significance, coherent visuals, making a convincing argument, accuracy. These are all about being a good physicist. You'll notice linguistic errors were barely on their radar, unless they actually interfered with understanding the content, like a typo on a slide. And here is the absolute game changer. The physicist applied these exact same standards to everyone, whether they were native English speakers or not. They didn't have a double standard. They cared about effective professional communication, period. The goal wasn't to sound like a native speaker. The goal was to be a competent physicist. And we see this exact same pattern in a completely different field, veterinary medicine. In another study, they had practicing vets, vet students, and even us linguists evaluate a student's interview with a pet owner. And look at the incredible consensus. Everyone, regardless of their background, zeroed in on the same core components: the structure of the interview, the ability to ask good follow-up questions, providing a clear summary. So the message from the field is crystal clear. In both of these cases, the definition of success wasn't based on some generic abstract language scale. The criteria were, as the source material puts it, inextricably intertwined with the specific goals and content of that particular task. They grew out of the situation itself. Okay, so we've identified the problem, we've looked at the evidence from the field, so where does that leave us? Well, all of this points toward a new and, I think, much more robust way of thinking about how we should be building these tests. Now, the proposal here isn't to just throw out decades of assessment research. It's what's known as the weak hypothesis. And the idea is actually quite elegant. We take these rich, authentic, indigenous criteria from the field, and we use them to supplement our traditional linguistic criteria. We're not replacing the old model, we're enriching it, making it stronger and more valid. Ultimately, what this all comes down to is a principle of alignment. The goal is to make our assessment criteria every bit as authentic and relevant as the tasks and content we worked so hard to create. If your test is designed to mirror the real world, then the way you grade it has to mirror real-world standards of success too. It just makes sense. In the end, when we ask that fundamental question, where should the standards for a specific purpose test come from? The answer, as Dan Douglas puts it so well, is that for LSP testing, the field itself is where they properly come from. It's so simple, it's profound, and it forces us to ask a much bigger question. One I'll leave you with today. In how many other areas are we still using the wrong ruler to measure what truly matters?